So, Tracy, what we'd like to start by asking really is a bit about your creative process.
Mhm.
Obviously, you're an author and a poet yourself and have a love of all things literature and literary. But it would be really interesting just to hear about when you were curating the anthology. Um, did you, for example, because we know lots of poets were approached by you to write pieces for the anthology to complement, your poets that you've included, like Langston Hughes and Joseph Coelho, who we love at Literacy Tree. He's just wonderful. Um, so when you commissioned those poems, was it with a specific theme in mind to sort of fit an overview, or was it more organic than that? Sort of, let's see the poems we end up with and how we can then shape some kind of sequence to the anthology.
Yeah, so I commissioned the poems after all of the other poems had been
Okay,
selected. So I already had a sense of the direction and the feeling and the flow,
okay,
and had a sense of where the holes were. So when I went out to the poets who contributed original poems, I specifically said, here are the themes where we have less around. Um, and up to I left it up to them whether they wanted to choose one of those themes or wanted to do something on their own. And I think most of them wrote around the themes where we needed a little bit more fleshing out. But really, I didn't want to inhibit them in any way. I wanted them to feel free to do whatever it is that they felt moved to do.
that's so lovely to hear about that. And in terms of the illustrations, which are just,
Stunning. I know. I feel so fortunate.
I mean, just right down, and I can see now right down to the portrait that Jade has created of you and her in the end with the authors, your bios, just wow, so
Yeah.
spot on.
Yeah.
And they're just really, they're tender in places, they're joyful in others. The use of color, shade is beautiful. Did you collaborate with Jade directly?
I didn't. No, not
No.
directly. I received sketches, like I received work in progress along the way to
Okay,
comment on. But ultimately, it was Jade and Tina, who was the designer on the Nosy Crow side, who made choices. And I actually had a moment toward the end of it all where I rearranged a bunch of the poems and I just felt like because it was very important to me to tell a story from beginning to end, to have
yes,
some sort of arc. And there were a couple of poems that felt out of place of that
okay,
notion. And I wanted to rearrange things, and it caused a bit of a panic because the color story had been so very intentionally thought about. So that once I was
okay,
pulling this piece that had, primarily blues and greens and moving it to somewhere that was less visually complementary for the sake of the narrative, then there was, we had to figure out, well, how much work, yeah, does Jade have to do, the illustrator have to do to to, satisfy or to meet the thing that I wanted to do editorially. So there was a little bit of a especially toward the end, a little bit of a give and take, a little bit of a compromise
yeah.
in terms of what I wanted to do and what Jade was willing and able to do, given the very thoughtful approach that she took to the creation of her work.
That's wonderful to hear, though, and I think so reassuring for children as writers and teachers of teaching writing that the creative process it is messy, and there'll be things that you do reserve the right to change your mind on at some point. Thank you. I think Alice has got a question
Yeah,
next.
I do. And actually, I feel like you've almost answered it in what
I
you
knew this would
said.
happen.
Because what stood out to us when we both got together this morning to have a bit of a chat about our thoughts was that we love that it's organized by theme or common threads between poems, and that as a result of that, you will get poems from very different times and places next to each other, but in conversation with one another, and it made for such an enjoyable reading experience where you can dip into any point of the book and be exposed to very different voices, but with something linking them all together. And I was going to ask you about the challenges of working with so many different poems and voices, and whether there were any points along the way where you just thought, what have I taken on?
Well, the team at Nosy Crow is incredibly generous with me. And, at the beginning of it, so the very first poem that I chose when I was invited to do this project. So Nosy Crow actually approached me about doing this, which was such an incredible honor. And I have a particular point of view in my work. Like I'm very honest and forthright, and I write for young children, but I don't like to sugarcoat the truth at all. So I wanted it to be very clear to Nosy Crow that I would bring that same sensibility to this book. So it wouldn't necessarily be a collection of poems about, frolicking in the meadow, although there is some of that too. So the very first poem then that I thought really sort of exemplified that point of view was Ross Gay's poem, A Needful Fact. Is that what a small needful fact? Oh my gosh, my brain. But that poem was about the death of a Black man at the hands of the police in the United States. Although if you don't know that, it's just a beautiful poem about a man who plants with big hands, who plants delicate flowers and creates beauty and air for us to breathe. And of course, those were his last words, Eric Garner's last words, I can't breathe. So I thought that poem, I knew this was going to be for a slightly older child. So I thought that poem, while it was written for adults and not children, would be accessible on many levels and would have that level of truth that I wanted to include, and was also really beautiful. And so I was really clear with Nosy Crow about saying this is the kind of poem that I want to include. So once we sort of had that very much established, I then just sort of threw things out there. Like at the very beginning, I was just sort of saying, what about this? Or what about this? And they would come back and they would say, this feels too old, or this feels too much like an adult looking back and less like a situation that a child might relate to. So there was a lot of back and forth at the very beginning. And then I sort of honed in on the idea of, like, I always knew Langston Hughes was going to be a major presence in the book. And I thought, well, what if we begin and end? And what if the whole book is like going through a dream and it's bringing in all of the things that Black folks, not all of the things, but as many as we can imagine that Black folks dream about, and putting them in this protective space with all this lovely art, and also bringing in some intrusions. There are some moments that are a little more difficult and quite honest. And then, when we get there, when we talk about Eric Garner, and we talk about Black Lives Matter, and we talk about those who are no longer with us, who were part of the struggle and part of the fight, we move from that into a new morning. So we have this sort of little bit of fretfulness, and then we reset the day with poems about mourning and go forward. And yeah, so I really, it was important for me to do exactly what you said, Alice, to be able to dip in and dip out, but also to really look at the piece as a whole. And I think that was particularly well served by the fact that because the book is being published in both the US and the UK simultaneously, and I had to include poems that poets that resided in both areas and experiences that reflected both cultural experiences, it just meant that everything was going to be all the richer for it. So I hope that answered your questions. I feel like I went a little bit off
Yes. No,
Possibly.
you absolutely didn't, because it that actually leads us really nicely on to what I was about to ask about. But that's an observation Alice and I made this morning, going back to the point you made about it being published simultaneously, released in the US and the UK on the same day. We noticed that it feels very balanced.
Mhm.
And yes, it's added to that richness, but also this idea of not sugarcoating, that's a huge part of what we do at Literacy Tree. And we have a lot of books as part of our offer that are challenging, and they have got truths within them. And just to echo that line in your introduction around poems that can be secrets that reveal themselves over time, I think that's right and proper for an anthology such as this, because children will be exposed to a poem like the one that you've just described, and then years later might have the opportunity to revisit and reflect and sort of reframe. So on that subject, Alice and I both particularly loved the poem Good Trouble. And I think specifically, well, wow, it's just such a delightful poem. And it's playful and joyful, but I think at its core, there's that really sad sort of message that it's very current, this
Yeah.
idea of having banned books. And, the discussions, particularly in Florida at the moment, and all the school boards who've banned books about LGBTQ representation. But the banning of books isn't obviously a new thing. I was lucky enough to be in Berlin for a few days over the summer. I've been there a couple of times before, but there's a town square in I think it was part of the East, and on the wrong side of the wall at one point, but there's a monument carved into the ground of this square where there's a
Mm.
vault underneath, and it's just empty bookshelves, and it's acknowledging books that were burned on that exact
Oh,
spot that
I just read
students were
about
not
this.
allowed to access.
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah.
And it's that any struggle, it's about sort of trying to keep people down and keep things quiet because of the power of literature. So that, I think that poem struck such a chord for Alice and I. And so really what we wanted to ask was, given that we actually have a lot of the books that are on the banned lists,
Mhm.
um, what would your advice be for teachers and parents navigating and around navigating and brokering certain poems within this anthology, so that the truth was told to children, but in such a way that everyone felt okay about it? But I think you might already have answered that by saying that morning then breaks and there's a new dawn and hope. But it would be really interesting to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, I should say that when I was gathering poems for this book, I was thinking about Black children. And I was thinking about the books or the poems that would make them feel seen, make
Mm.
them feel empowered, make them feel worthy. I wanted to celebrate Black children. So that was really the audience that
Yeah.
was at the forefront of my mind. I know that my job is to sell this book, but I'm not concerned about people being uncomfortable with it.
No, nor are we.
Yeah, so I am not sure how to answer that question. I guess I would just say that if anyone is uncomfortable with the poems that are in this book, that maybe there's a little bit of a self-examination that needs to happen there,
Yeah.
and it's a self-curiosity, like what is it that makes you uncomfortable about the message that's here, and why, do you potentially feel that it's not quite right for your child? Because none of the poems, I think almost all of the poems in this book that are sort of touching on challenging topics, I think the majority of them were actually written for children
Yeah.
or young adults. There are a few exceptions, of course, but a good number of them, like the poem that you're talking about by Nikki Grimes, that was one of the commissioned ones. So she wrote that very specifically for children. Um, yeah, so I that is always the sort of tension with my work, which is that I know that this is a business, and I know that there are things to be considered for the sake of sales, and I am not concerned. I
Yeah.
just I want all children to see the worth and the value and the importance of these poems and poets and be curious enough to explore beyond the pages of this book. I mean, that's really my dream, is that this is enough of sort of an appetite whetting to then get children to research the poems. That was one of the like heartbreaking things that I am someone who writes biographies primarily. And so
Yeah.
then to not be able to include the biographies of these poets was just so I hope that children explore that and then find all the many other poems by these poets, and then find the poems by the people who they associated with in their world. Like I really hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, but if you're so uncomfortable that you can't even, I really don't know what to say to that.
Yeah, no, that's such a beautiful answer. And it's exactly what we would say. And I perhaps didn't word this very well, but I think some teachers become anxious about vocabulary or language that we use. And a huge part of the work we do at Literacy Tree is talking with authors like yourself to ask. So, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with a series of books called the Lizzie and Bell Mysteries that have just taken the market in the UK by storm, written by an author called J.T. Williams, about Dido Bell and the history around acting and the first Black man to play Othello, and that richness of history that isn't taught. And I think one of the poems echoes that.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot the teachers we work with in our schools, fortunately, because they're completely with us on you know facing uncomfortable truths through literature sometimes, because it's important for children's mental well-being and safety and all these things. Fortunately, they're with us, but they will often ask, oh, we're using a text that's got historic language that you mention this in your foreword, which I think is really helpful. And things like the word black isn't capitalized in some of the older poems, but now it would be, and so on. But yes, it's just interesting to have that. And we would always encourage our teachers, certainly, to use literature that does challenge them, that they've got to plan how to broker so that they can manage those conversations really effectively and safely. But it's just interesting to hear your take, because you're absolutely right. I think putting something like this out into the world that's the whole point. It's about starting a conversation, and what a powerful conversation this anthology, I think, is going to start. I mean, can't wait to
Oh.
shout about it.
Thank you.
Anyway, I'm rambling on.
No, I hope that's right. But I will say that I was very, I didn't want to, as much as I could help it, exclude poets who I felt had something to say, or at least
Yeah,
something that was very much in keeping with the message that I wanted to offer,
yeah,
because the language was different. I didn't want to include any slurs or anything like that. But language changes over time, and I think there's a really interesting lesson there too, about not just about poetry, but just how language changes, how
yeah,
the meanings of things, like why were these words chosen in this poem that was written in 1960 or whatever.
yeah.
Um, so I hope that the educators will see the opportunities there rather than um, the concern. But I can imagine I can imagine. I know that I don't know what it's like there, but I know that here teachers are so scrutinized for the things that they bring to the classroom. So I imagine there is some concern there.
Yeah, and there can be in some of our schools. I think there's been a sea change in recent years in the UK, which we hope sustains itself.
Mm.
But there are other awful political things happening as well, and that threaten the sort of the integrity, I suppose, of what teachers
Yeah.
are doing in schools. Um, but yeah, I mean, quite often with resources, for any number of reasons that we create, we will provide guidance notes for teachers so that teachers will be able to put literature out into a classroom really effectively, and I suppose from a place of safety, which I think is really, really powerful, because I think a lot of teachers worry about getting things wrong,
Mm.
saying and doing the wrong thing. Thank you. Alice, you had another question, didn't you?
I did. And I think linking to that and what you were saying about a poem written not all that long ago in the 1960s might have completely different language to today. And it's relatively recent history. It might be kids' grandparents.
Mm,
And for throughout the book, I think one of the key things I took away was this idea of looking back to look forwards. And there are several poems about standing on the shoulders of your forebearers, whether they're people in your personal life, parents, grandparents, or activists or poets. Um, and yeah, it was beautiful. And I wanted to ask you about the, for you, curating this, the relationship between past, present, and future, and the importance of putting kind of voices from the 20th century next to and intermingled with emerging voices.
Mhm. I so most of what I write, like I said, is biography. I am constantly researching the past. I'm quite aware of history. I mean, I love it. And I think it's important to recognize that the work being done today comes out of work that has been done in the past, and that a lot of the patterns that we see today we've already seen, like you were saying about the banning of books and the burning of books and all of this. Um, I think it's important I think it's important for children to know that Black poetry has a long lineage. Poems by Black poets is a long, long lineage. Um, and I think it's interesting to see when someone who has written in the early 20th century and who has written in, the 21st century is saying a very similar thing. Cross culturally too, I think that's interesting to see when you have somebody from. I tried to include a number of poems from throughout the diaspora, so not just from the UK and the US, but from South Africa and from several other African and South American countries as well. Um, when you see these poets are raising some of the same concerns in perhaps different ways, but the sentiment is the same. I think there's something powerful about that. Uh,
mm,
yeah, I think I have recently been researching sort of West African thinkings around time and the idea that time, the present is the current moment, but the past is long. And so the current moment owes so much to the past, and the future is only it hasn't happened yet, so it hardly matters. Um, and I just think that it's really important to think about the present as part of this long history. Like did not just pop here. We are part of a story um, that is centuries old, many millennia. Um, so yeah, I think it's really important for it was important for me to look back in this book, to honor the poets who came before, to honor the stories who came before, and to help children understand that just because something is old, just because something is from, decades and decades and decades ago, does not mean that it has no worth, it has no value.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the with the last poem in the book, and you have that illustration of the constellations making up, like, I think there's Martin Luther King, but there are also sort of ancestral figures going much further back in time. And I just thought it was the most perfect poem and page to put it all together.
Oh, I'm so glad you think so. And it was really, I felt very fortunate to find poems about African mythology and gods and, characters that some of which I knew growing up and some of which I didn't, or saw, or characters that have names, different names, same characters, but different and similar names in different parts of the diaspora. I mean, there's so much here that I really couldn't explore as much as I would have liked to in the back matter. But yeah, I think all of that, it's just all such this wonderful mix of back and forth and past and present and
Yes, definitely. There's definitely, like, I think it was like, is it Anansi the spider tail and things like that? I left and I wanted to go away. And like you say, you have that sort of eagerness to do your own research. But I think that's a really positive thing about the book. It's not a limitation.
That's the thing. Yeah. And it just, but it also feels so satisfyingly complete and whole. So I think you've done such a good job in, the positioning of everything. It just feels so beautiful. Because I sometimes struggle with a poetry anthology, I've got to be honest, if it's just a scattergun, disjointed. It's the storytelling that you get through this, that sort of golden thread of magic that's just, oh, it's perfect.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
No, but it's true. It really is true. And it's so nice to get that insight into your process and your thinking. Final question, you'll be relieved to hear, Tracy. A little bit more of a light-hearted one, but which poem would you choose as a read aloud for children and why?
Oh my
The
gosh.
anthology.
I think I think it's impossible to choose just one. I mean, I would say A Small Needful Fact just because that's where it started and I feel that that's really beautiful, but I think the poems by Eve Ewing are meant to be read aloud. I think that I don't know which one I would choose. I mean, This Is Not a Small Voice is such a beautiful, beautiful poem that I feel very honored that we were able to include it and use it as the title of the book. I think so many of the poems are meant to be read aloud, but I also think that some of them are just meant to be savored on the page. Um,
Mm,
so I think that's a good mix too. I love the haiku by Richard Wright. I mean, it just, yeah.
Yeah,
gorgeous.
so
Just
much.
gorgeous.
So much rhyme and rhythm in so many of them. And when I was reading it, I remember coming across the page with checking out me history by, is it
Yeah.
John Todd?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
that was in my GCSE, so my sort of like school anthology at secondary school that we had to do exams on. And I remember the teacher showing a video of him reading the poem and how transformative it is when it goes from the page to a performance. And
Yeah.
I hope that parents, teachers will be able to read these to really little ones where they can just enjoy the sounds and words that might be new to them. And I think there's so many opportunities for that in here.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that poem because that poem to me felt like such a revelation because it was new to me. And I think it'll be really a new and special experience for American audiences. But yeah, that I wish I could have found a sort of an answer poem or a poem in conversation from an American poet mentioning, some of the things that don't get mentioned about American history. But yeah, I really love that poem, and I feel very fortunate that we were able to include it. Of course, I can't find it now, but yeah, that poem is something else.
Yeah.
Love it.
I think we all are. Oh, thank you so much, Traci. You have spoken so generously and eloquently, and we cannot wait for, our schools to hear about this book. I do think that it's probably something we might want to do something with down the line.